Pax vobiscum. Welcome to Vesta, where we discuss the book we've just completed reading here on the channel. Today's book discussion is The Cradle of the Deep by Joan Lowell. We'll begin by taking a look at the physical book itself, then examine the book's author, followed by an analysis of the controversy surrounding the book and the themes presented therein. So now let us take a look at the book. So here we see the physical book of The Cradle of the Deep, the edition that I was reading from, which is a first edition, first published in 1929. I looked around to try to find the particular book I was looking for, and I was so lucky to find what I wanted on eBay, of all places. And I say of all places as if that is not one of the very first places that I go to search for books to read on the channel, however. But looking at the book, I was very happy to find that it was in quite good condition. There are some issues with the binding and some wearing away of color and so forth, but I really do think that one of my favorite traits of books from earlier centuries is how art was interwoven with written word. That is, chapter illustrations, decorated end papers, even beautifully designed covers. Simple just as good as the ornate. It makes the book feel more alive and special, something to be treasured and kept rather than tossed into a landfill once you're done reading it. I love collecting first editions or first printings, and I was lucky to get my hands on this one. She has seen some trials, but my hope is to keep her safe for years to come. And now, speaking of her, let's take a look at the author of this book, Joan Lowell, or her birth name as she may also be known, Helen Wagner. Helen Wagner, later Joan Lowell, was born on November 23, 1902 in Berkeley, California. Now, having read The Cradle of the Deep, the autobiography of Helen Wagner turned Joan Lowell, we'd expect to know that her formative years were spent aboard the schooner Minnie A. Kane, her father's ship. From 11 months old to age 17, she claimed to have sailed the seas until a fire sank the vessel and returned her to life on land. You've heard the story. What a fascinating childhood. Or at least, it would have been a fascinating childhood, if it were true. The Cradle of the Deep was published in 1929 by Simon & Schuster as a non-fiction autobiography. The book was an immediate bestseller, pushing Joan Lowell into the spotlight and granting her access to parties, photo shoots, and speaking tours. However, just 1 month after publication, several skeptical reporters brought forward evidence that the so-called autobiography was in fact a complete fabrication. The Minnie A. Kane, which Lowell claimed had sunk, was found perfectly intact in a harbor near Oakland. Neighbors in Berkeley recalled young Helen attending school regularly in the local area, not sailing the high seas. It appeared the most time Joan spent on the ship were short trips with her parents, the longest being a 15-month trip, not 17 years. Even when confronted with the evidence, Joan doubled down. In a 1930 interview with the Pittsburgh Press, she said, 80% of it was true and the rest I colored up. I made some changes to protect people, and the rest to make it better reading. That's an author's privilege. Despite the scandal and the publisher having to offer refunds and reclassify the book as fiction, sales continued strong. Now, while not completely true, it was true that Joan's father captained the Minnie A. Kane, and what a story she was able to spin from that one kernel of truth. Joan was no stranger to storytelling. In fact, she was very involved with the arts, not just as an author, but also as an actress. Before writing The Cradle of the Deep, Joan starred in several silent films of the 1920s, including The Gold Rush, Loving Lies, Captain Dan, The Cub, and Branded a Thief. Her Hollywood career, like her first marriage to a producer, was short-lived, but she also spent some time working as a reporter in New York City. Then, in 1934, Joan sailed to the Indies along with her father and his ship to film Adventure Girl, a movie based on Cradle of the Deep. Joan Lowell then married Sea Captain Leek Bowen in 1936. They moved to the countryside of Brazil, where they established a coffee plantation. Their farm, called the Anchorage, was located in Anápolis, in the Brazilian state of Goiás. In addition to farming, Joan worked as a real estate agent, and allegedly sold land to several Hollywood actors. Though Joan didn't grow up in the Cradle of the Deep, the seas still seemed to hold a lasting fascination for her, judging by her choice of second marriage and the name of their plantation. Her love of writing didn't end with that first controversial book. In fact, she went on to write 2 more, this time based on her real-life experiences. Reporter Gal, written in 1933, was based on her time as a journalist, and Promised Land, 1952, chronicled her years in Brazil. Joan lived in Brazil with her husband until her death on November 7, 1967. She was 64 years old. As we can see, Joan Lowell certainly led an interesting life. From what I could gather in my research, she was headstrong, dramatic, and firm in her beliefs, traits that may have helped her succeed in the face of controversy. Despite the backlash, she continued to publish, perform, and shape a life she clearly loved. And so now that we've discussed the life and the myth of Joan Lowell, let's turn our attention to the writing itself. I will say I actually quite enjoyed reading the book. I tend to read quickly, so it only took me a day. What drew me in at first was the belief, the assumption, that it was truly an autobiography. At the beginning I was captivated. I have friends that have had stranger life stories than Joan Lowell's, but this? It was truly something else, and I was hooked. But as I kept reading, my excitement started to wane here and there. She seemed to go through every possible sea trial as if ticking off a checklist. Some parts just felt off, incorrect, too convenient, too neatly arranged. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book I stopped and began to wonder, is this a first edition really? Was it edited? Did something get changed? So I looked it up, and that's when I discovered for myself that it was not a true autobiography. It was in fact a fictionalized tale, likely based on a 15-month sea voyage, not 17 years at sea. I was disappointed, but I kept reading, not just because the story remained engaging, but because it made me uncomfortable. Now you may be asking, Vivi, why keep reading a book that made you blatantly uncomfortable? Well, dear friend, here is my answer. I think it's good to be uncomfortable with what we read sometimes. We can read, we can comprehend, we can understand without condoning, and that is an important skill. To be able to take in information, stories, art, analyze it, acknowledge it, and then be able to discuss it. That's why, even though the book contains themes, moments, and language that were shocking or unsettling to me, I continued reading. Because I understood the context, I understood the era, and because even though it's fiction, Joan did write about things that were very real. I do pray that some of the things Joan described did not happen to her, not in her childhood and certainly never in her real life. The chapter about the old sailor who hung himself in drunken depression, the sailor who kissed her when she was a child, the sailor she admired, who kissed her even though she was 17 and cut a lock of her hair. I do tend to wonder how much of that all was included for shock value. There are some times during her writing where her tone felt very pick-me, as if she was saying, "Oh, look how different I am from other girls. I'm special." There was that, but then there was also what I previously mentioned. I hope that those incidences did not happen, that I hope it was all just a device to provoke reaction, and not lived experience. Even if unintentional, there are important lessons buried in these chapters, lessons worth discussing, lessons born of the stories she wrote, of those terrible incidents. For me, after reading this, all of those moments, all those experiences seem to weave together into one overarching theme, the theme that stayed with me the most, long after I closed the book and thought of it, was this. Growing up is surely a painful process. Joan writes childhood exceptionally well, I think. She captures that in-between space, that tender, blurry edge between innocence and almost adulthood with painful clarity. There are moments in this book where you just want to reach into the page, stop the scene, and say, "Please just tell your father, Joan. Please please speak to someone, ask for help. But Joan doesn't. She makes her choices, and we, the readers, are left to flinch, to grit our teeth, and that, I think, is good writing. Children don't form their beliefs out of thin air. They learn them. They absorb them from their environment, from the people around them, from what is said and what is not said, from what is done and from what is not done. Joan, the character in the book Joan, is shaped by what she sees and hears on that ship, by what she's taught, explicitly or otherwise, by her father and the sailors. Some of that learning is valuable, but some of it is harmful. She often seems to believe she has no one to turn to, so when something happens to her, her instinct is not to confide in someone, but to get even, to hold it in on herself, to not snitch, to restore her sense of justice herself. It does not seem like a strength, but merely a method of survival. She suffers because of the unspoken code of the ship, one that seems to reward silence and punishes vulnerability. Her very femininity has to be hidden, not just to avoid ridicule, but to keep her safe, and her father goes to great lengths to do this. Her thoughts, her instincts, her fears, things that she's considered before and things that she is guilty of, labeled as airheaded or weak by her father, who claims that he does everything that he does to keep her on the right path. It's difficult to read at times, but it is valuable, and I believe in some way it is a reminder. A reminder that we were all children once, and that how we were treated, how we were taught, all of those things still echo in ways that we don't think about necessarily. We can find echoes of what we've been taught and how we were treated in the way we think and act today. And so, even though this book was about a rip-roaring adventure on the high seas and growing up on a ship and how it's not the romantic thing that other books make it out to be, I sort of took The Cradle of the Deep as a call to look at my own life. Maybe as a call to you to look at your own as well and say, why do I respond to certain things the way I do? What beliefs did I inherit without even realizing it? What did I learn, and who did I learn it from? And then that led me, personally in my own reflection, to think about what are we passing on to the children and young people in our lives? Are we offering guidance, safety, understanding, tough love in the sense that we parent them or help them transition from that childhood to adult? Or are we unintentionally or intentionally passing on silence, judgment, and fear? This book, among many other things, made me consider that deeply. I did not expect that to be what I was considering, but here we are. We can't shield children from every pain, nor should we. Just as Joan demonstrated and showed through different examples in her book, pain teaches too. But we can offer places of safety. We can control the level of pain to some extent, depending on the situation. We can remember our own growing up, how we were once children once, and let it inform the kind of adults we choose to be. That, to me, is the real treasure buried in this book. I tend to always think outside the box, if you will, and pull meaning and expression from things that maybe an author never intended to be, but it was not the sea tales, not the shipwreck, and not even the overall scandal of the book that stuck out to me, but the truth, fictionalized though it may be, about what it means to grow up, and how easily we can hurt each other, or help each other, along the way. Thank you one and all for joining me for this Vesta Vox episode. So today we've looked at the book The Cradle of the Deep by Joan Lowell, not just as a book, but as a moment in literary history, due to scandal, and to the depictions that it shows. We looked at the physical copy of the book itself, the life of its controversial author, Joan Lowell, and the themes she wove into her story, intentionally or not. At its heart, this book isn't just a sea tale. It's about the pain of growing up, the silence children can carry, and the echoes of the lessons they're taught. Whether fact or fiction, Joan's story invites us to reflect on our own experiences and how we shape the next generation through the lives we lead and the words we speak. Thank you for reading this book and reflecting upon it with me. If this brought up any thoughts for you, I'd love to hear them. Do please leave a comment below. And until next time, dear friends, take care. Pax vobiscum. Goodbye.